The anniversary dinner sparkled with lights that bounced off crystal glasses and polished silverware. A celebration meant to symbolize love and longevity. Laughter drifted across the table, the clinking of wine glasses creating a rhythm of festivity. She sat gracefully, her eyes absorbing every detail, the candles flickering, the music humming softly in the background, the guests smiling in admiration. Then, as if slicing through the warmth of the evening, her husband's voice rose above the harmony. With a smirk and a tone sharp enough to silence the room, he declared her worthless. The laughter died. Forks paused midair. Guests exchanged uneasy glances caught in the shock of the moment. Yet, instead of collapsing under the weight of humiliation, she simply smiled. A smile that was quiet, knowing, and unsettling. It wasn't surrender. It was a signal that beneath the surface, something unexpected was waiting. In the early years, anniversaries felt like fairy tales written just for her. The first one had been modest, a dinner at a small restaurant, a single red rose. At his nervous smile as he reached across the table to hold her hand. It wasn't the luxury that mattered. It was the sincerity, the way his eyes lit up when he looked at her, as if she were the only person in the world. With every passing year, the celebrations grew richer, not just in material gifts, but in the depth of connection they shared. Friends and family admired them, often calling their marriage the picture of happiness. There were nights filled with laughter that carried them past midnight, mornings of whispered promises over coffee, and moments where he'd surprise her with letters tucked inside books she loved. Each anniversary became a milestone, not only of their marriage, but of the bond they believed unshakable. She kept mementos, handwritten notes, pressed flowers, even the menus from places they dined together. They were tokens of a time when love felt pure and unwavering. Yet even as the memories gleamed, shadows began to creep in. Subtle changes, almost invisible at first, hinted at a shift. He stopped listening as intently to her stories, once thoughtful. Gifts began to feel rushed, more an obligation than an act of love. During one anniversary dinner, while guests toasted them, he scrolled through his phone under the table, detached and distracted. She laughed it off, telling herself it was stress from work, a phase that would pass. The warmth of shared laughter became less frequent, replaced by small silences that stretched uncomfortably long. The respect in his eyes dulled, replaced by something colder, something distant. There were moments she caught him sighing when she spoke, as if her words were a burden. The guests who once praised their bond now noticed the strain, though no one dared mention it aloud. And yet she still held on to hope. She replayed the old anniversaries in her mind like a favorite song, convincing herself that the man who once cherished her still existed somewhere beneath the layers of indifference. But with every passing year, the gap widened. What was once a celebration of love was turning into a performance for others. A carefully staged play where affection had been replaced with duty. And intimacy had been replaced with habit. The anniversaries became mirrors, reflecting not just their shared history, but the slow unraveling of respect and tenderness. Where once she was the center of his world, now she was treated as though her presence was peripheral, her worth diminishing in the very home she had built with him. The seeds of change had been planted quietly, and though she noticed their roots spreading, she chose silence, for now. The shift was subtle at first, barely noticeable to anyone outside their home. It began with small dismissals, moments so brief they could almost be excused as jokes. When she offered suggestions about the household, he would wave his hand and mutter, "Leave it, I'll handle it," as though her input were trivial. At dinners, when she shared stories with friends, he would interrupt with a laugh, correcting her in front of others, twisting her words for amusement. The room laughed with him, but she felt the sting in her chest. In private, the dismissals became sharper. He mocked the way she hummed while cooking, calling it noise, even though once he had told her it was the sound that made the house feel alive. He criticized her careful budgeting, labeling her old-fashioned, forgetting that it was her discipline that had once steadied their finances. She bore the remarks quietly, her silence becoming a shield, though inside every word etched deeper cracks in her heart. Family gatherings exposed more of his growing arrogance. When relatives praised her cooking or her thoughtful hosting, he would smirk and say, "Yes, she has too much free time, so she experiments." The words, dressed in humor, dripped with belittlement. Friends began to notice too. They exchanged glances when he rolled his eyes at her comments or sighed loudly while she spoke. The respect that once wrapped around their marriage was unraveling thread by thread, replaced by the arrogance he wore like armor. His rising ego wasn't confined to their home. Success at work seemed to fuel it, and he carried that swagger into every interaction, overshadowing her presence entirely. Where once he introduced her with pride, now she was simply my wife, an afterthought in his narrative. She became the silent figure beside him, the one who smiled politely while he basked in the admiration of others. Yet beneath the surface of her quietness, a different strength brewed. She absorbed the humiliation but never let it define her. While he grew louder in arrogance, she grew stronger in silence. Her dignity became her power, a quiet force he couldn't recognize, blinded as he was by his own ego. Friends whispered about the change, some pitying her, others wondering how she endured. But she knew something he didn't. Arrogance always blinds, and silence often holds the sharpest weapon. The cracks behind the curtain widened. No longer hidden, but visible to all who looked closely. What was once a partnership was turning into a stage where he played the lead role. And she, in his eyes, was reduced to a background character. He failed to see that the story was still unfolding. And the quiet strength he dismissed would one day rewrite the script entirely. Before the world ever knew him as successful, she had already woven the foundation of his life with threads of sacrifice and devotion. In the earliest years, when money was scarce and dreams seemed distant, she became both anchor and sail. While he pursued his education, she worked tirelessly, taking on odd jobs to pay rent, cooking frugal meals from little, and stretching every coin into something meaningful. She went without luxuries, often even without necessities, so that he could focus on climbing ladders she quietly steadied for him. Every achievement he flaunted bore traces of her invisible hand. The late nights when he studied, she was the one who kept the lamp burning, ensuring the room stayed warm, ensuring he had food to fuel his ambition. The job interviews he walked into confidently. She was the one who ironed his shirt, rehearsed answers with him, and reassured him when doubts gnawed at his confidence. Behind every accolade he collected, her fingerprints remained, though the world never saw them. When children entered their lives, her sacrifices only deepened. She became the backbone of the home, raising their family while still standing guard over his career. She managed school fees, family budgets, hospital visits, and the countless unseen tasks that made their house a home. She made sure he never had to choose between career and family. She shouldered the weight of both so he could shine. While he advanced in boardrooms, she advanced in silence, ensuring no crack in their world would distract him from his ambitions. He thrived, but as his stature grew, so did his blindness to the quiet architect behind him. Soon his narrative shifted. At gatherings, he claimed sole credit for their success. He described himself as self-made, dismissing the years she had worked 2 jobs or pawned her jewelry just to keep them afloat. She became the accessory. At his side, the smiling wife whose worth was measured only by how well she complemented his image. The symbolism of her life was heavy. She was the invisible architect of his empire. Every brick of his career was laid upon her sacrifices, every triumph fueled by her unseen labor. Yet he paraded as though she had merely walked in his shadow, not realizing the shadow itself was cast by the light she had carried for years. Friends and relatives sometimes noticed. They whispered about her dedication, about how she seemed to be everywhere and nowhere. holding together a family and a future with hands that were rarely acknowledged. She smiled through it, never demanding applause, never needing validation. But in her silence, she carried something more powerful than gratitude: knowledge. She knew that while he mistook her quietness for weakness, it was, in fact, her greatest strength. Suspense brewed beneath this history of sacrifice. For though he now dismissed her, mocked her, and paraded arrogance as though it were armor, she held something he could not imagine. She had not lived a lifetime of dedication without also weaving foresight into her choices. Beneath the quiet surface of her sacrifices, a hidden layer of preparation had always existed, one that would one day remind him that the accessory he overlooked was the architect of both his rise and his eventual reckoning. The restaurant was alive with celebration that night. Crystal chandeliers glowed warmly above, casting golden light across a long table adorned with roses and sparkling glasses. Laughter floated in the air, toasts rang out, and the occasion, their anniversary, should have been a tribute to love, partnership, and endurance. Guests leaned in, expecting to hear affectionate words from the husband about the woman who had stood beside him for decades. But instead of tenderness, the room was pierced by cruelty. With a smirk curled at the edge of his lips, he raised his glass. "Here's to my wife," he declared, his tone laced with mockery rather than love. The crowd chuckled at first, thinking perhaps a harmless joke was coming. But his words cut sharper than any knife. "She's outdated, unworthy. A burden I've carried far too long." A stunned silence spread across the table. Forks froze midair, laughter died instantly, and all eyes turned to her. The air seemed to thicken, heavy with disbelief. In that moment, the illusion of respectability shattered. He didn't hesitate. He reveled in the spectacle, as if diminishing. Her worth elevated his. His voice grew louder, feeding on the discomfort of the audience. He painted her sacrifices as irrelevance, her presence as dead weight, her life as something expendable. Humiliation drenched her like ice water. Yet she didn't flinch. She didn't rise to argue or plead. She simply sat still, her spine straight, her hands resting gracefully on the table. Her eyes did not brim with tears. They glimmered instead with a quiet, knowing light. And then came the smile. Small, steady, enigmatic. It wasn't the smile of someone broken, nor the smile of someone trying to mask pain. It was the smile of someone who knew more than he did. A smile that unsettled because it suggested a secret strength he could neither define nor destroy. Guests shifted in their seats, caught between pity for her and discomfort at the cruelty they'd just witnessed. Some dared to glance at her husband, silently condemning his arrogance. But he mistook her silence as victory. Blind to the storm, her composure foreshadowed. The contrast was striking. On one side of the table sat arrogance, flaunting itself with loud words, intoxicated with self-importance. On the other sat dignity, cloaked in silence, unshaken by humiliation. Her restraint was not weakness. It was power wrapped in patience. While he threw words like daggers, she absorbed them with the grace of someone who knew daggers lose their edge against steel. The evening dragged on, but the atmosphere never recovered. Every cheer afterward felt forced, every laugh hollow. Guests would later remember that moment as the night his pride unmasked him, and her smile haunted them, lingering like a riddle unanswered. What did she know that allowed her to endure humiliation with such serenity? What truth lay hidden behind that quiet, unsettling curve of her lips? He thought he had written the final chapter of her story that night, sealing her worthlessness before an audience. What he failed to realize was that his cruelty had not silenced her. It had only set the stage. That smile, unnoticed by him, but remembered by everyone else, was the first glimpse of the reckoning to come. The restaurant was alive with celebration that night. Crystal chandeliers glowed warmly above, casting golden light across a long table adorned with roses and sparkling glasses. Laughter floated in the air. Toasts rang out, and the occasion. Their anniversary should have been a tribute to love, partnership, and endurance. Guests leaned in, expecting to hear affectionate words from the husband about the woman who had stood beside him for decades. But instead of tenderness, the room was pierced by cruelty. With a smirk curled at the edge of his lips, he raised his glass. "Here's to my wife," he declared, his tone laced with mockery rather than love. The crowd chuckled at first, thinking perhaps a harmless joke was coming. But his words cut sharper than any knife. "She's outdated, unworthy, a burden I've carried far too long." A stunned silence spread across the table. Forks froze midair, laughter died instantly, and all eyes turned to her. The air seemed to thicken, heavy with disbelief. In that moment, the illusion of respectability shattered. The dinner ended, but the humiliation lingered like smoke that refused to clear. Guests left the restaurant in clusters, their voices hushed but sharp, carrying the echoes of what they had just witnessed. The clinking glasses, the golden chandeliers, the roses on the table, all of it faded into the background. What remained was the unforgettable moment of a man publicly reducing his wife to worthless, and her quiet, unsettling smile in response. On the steps outside, whispers sparked like fire catching dry leaves. Some guests lowered their voices, speaking in tones of pity. Poor woman. Imagine giving your life to someone only to be treated like that. Others weren't as kind. Their words dripped with gossip, ready to travel fast through the veins of the community. "Did you see how she just sat there? Maybe he's right. Maybe she has nothing left to offer." By the next morning, the incident had grown wings. Neighbors discussed it over fences, in grocery aisles, and at morning tea. Friends repeated it in half-sympathetic, half-sensational tones. Some shook their heads in genuine sorrow, recalling the woman's years of grace, hospitality, and sacrifice. Others mocked behind polite smiles, using her silence as proof of weakness. The story became a mirror. People saw in it whatever suited their own biases: compassion, cruelty, or justification for judgment. Community pressure began to build like a storm cloud. Invitations to gatherings became hesitant. Calls came laced with questions disguised as concern. "Are you all right, dear?" some would ask, only to retell her humiliation as soon as the receiver clicked. Her dignity became a topic for entertainment. Every glance on the street felt weighted with what they thought they knew. Yet through it all, she walked with the same poise, the same gentle smile. That composure unsettled people even more. The cruel ones wondered why she wasn't broken. The sympathetic ones quietly prayed she had some hidden strength left. And in hushed corners, a few remarked, "Did you see that smile? That wasn't weakness. That was something else." The whispers created an invisible cage, pity on one side, ridicule on the other. But cages only hold those who surrender to them. She did not. Instead, she carried herself as though she held a secret larger than their gossip, a truth that would one day silence every voice. The husband, meanwhile, basked in what he thought was triumph. He didn't hear the whispers of condemnation, only the echoes of his own arrogance. He mistook gossip for validation, blind to the shifting tides. What he failed to realize was that, while the community judged her, they also judged him harshly. To humiliate someone in private is cruelty. To do so in public is disgrace. The whispers carried not only her story, but his exposure. The stage was being set, though few could see it. Every cruel word, every mocking laugh, every pitying sigh was weaving a backdrop against which her eventual revelation would shine brighter. The whispers thought they were burying her. In truth, they were only amplifying the silence before the storm. Behind her serene smile lay years of quiet labor, the kind that left no trace for those blinded by arrogance. While her husband basked in applause, chasing admiration and flaunting status, she worked in silence, weaving an invisible shield of preparation. Every insult, every dismissal, every act of being pushed into the shadows only sharpened her instinct to secure herself. What looked like passivity to outsiders was, in truth, strategy. Her foresight stretched back decades. When he mocked her frugality, she was documenting expenses, tucking away savings, and filing legal papers with meticulous care. He laughed when she insisted on joint meetings with lawyers, but those signatures, carefully arranged, gave her more control than he ever suspected. While he poured money into fleeting luxuries, she invested in quiet permanence, bonds, stocks, and properties he had never bothered to notice. The documents told the real story. Titles with her name alone, trusts drawn up to protect her security, clauses buried in contracts that ensured his empire was tethered to her hand. She had spent hours poring over fine print, her glasses perched on her nose while he dismissed her as obsessive and boring. What he saw as eccentricity was in fact the architecture of survival, suspense built in the details she kept hidden. A locked drawer in her study, a leather folder in a safety deposit box, carefully sealed envelopes addressed to the lawyer she trusted. Each contained proof of her foresight, evidence of a power far greater than the hollow applause her husband craved. She was not just protecting herself, she was waiting patiently for the moment arrogance would expose itself. And her quiet strength could emerge, and emerge it would. Her preparations were not about revenge, but resilience. She understood. Storms would come. She had lived through many. What her husband never realized was that she had already calculated the cost of betrayal long before he uttered the word worthless. By then, the game was no longer his to control. The suspense thickened, not in what she had done, but in what she was about to do to him. She was the invisible wife. To the world, soon, she would be revealed as the invisible architect, the one who held the keys to everything he thought was his. Her silence was not surrender. It was the sound of preparation. And preparation, she knew, was the purest form of power. The air in the dining room still carried the bitter aftertaste of humiliation. Glasses stood half full. Laughter had dissolved into uneasy silence, and guests lingered awkwardly, their eyes darting between husband and wife. He leaned back smugly, in his chair, basking in what he thought was the final word, his declaration that she was worthless. But her smile had not faded. If anything, it had grown sharper, a quiet flame against the ashes of his arrogance. She rose slowly, the rustle of her gown cutting through the silence. In her hands was a leather folder, aged yet firm, its weight far heavier than appearances suggested. As she placed it on the polished table, the sound was unmistakable, a final gavel striking, conversation stilled. The guests leaned in, breath caught. "I believe," she said softly, her voice steady. "It's time we clear the air." He scoffed, waving her off. "More dramatics. Don't embarrass yourself further." But his confidence faltered when she slid open the folder and withdrew a stack of documents, deeds, contracts, bank records. Each bore her name, her signature, her authority. "This house," she said, tapping the first page, "stands under my sole ownership. Purchased, paid, and registered long before you assumed it was yours." Gasps rippled through the room. She turned another page. "The company's stocks you flaunt, held under my trust. The savings accounts you never questioned, built from my years of planning, not your impulsive spending." His smirk crumbled. He snatched at the papers, scanning the signatures, the seals, the undeniable proof staring back at him. His arrogance began to wither, replaced by a dawning horror. One by one, she laid the truths bare. Properties in her name, bonds carefully accumulated, investments that had quietly flourished under her watch. The empire he boasted about, the wealth he believed was his crown, piece by piece. She revealed it had always been hers. The guests shifted uneasily, their earlier whispers, now stunned silence. Some stared at her with wide-eyed admiration. Others turned their gaze toward him with thinly veiled contempt. The contrast was sharp, his face, pale and trembling, versus her calm, resolute presence. "You called me worthless," she continued, her voice low but cutting. "But every brick of this life you parade was laid by my hands, my foresight, my sacrifices, my patience. Worthless? No. Invisible, perhaps, but not anymore." He tried to protest, stammering excuses, searching for allies among the crowd. None came. His arrogance, once a shield, now lay shattered on the floor. The very people he sought to impress now witnessed his unraveling. Her smile never wavered. She didn't raise her voice, didn't gloat. She let the document speak, let the truth weigh heavier than any insult he had hurled. Her dignity towered above his humiliation. And the silence that followed was not emptiness, it was victory. The reckoning had come, not with anger, but with proof. And in that moment, everyone understood the man who had declared her worthless was standing in the shadow of the woman who held everything. The house, once echoing with his booming voice and arrogant laughter, had fallen into a silence that carried more weight than any words. The guests had left, whispers trailing behind them like shadows, and the grand dining table sat littered with the remains of a celebration that had transformed into a battlefield. She sat alone now, her documents neatly gathered back into their folder. Her heart calm, her spirit unshaken. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to breathe without the weight of his belittlement pressing down. She thought of his words worthless and let them crumble into dust, stripped of their power. He had hurled them like daggers, but she realized the truth. Worth was never something another could grant or deny. It was carved from resilience, foresight, and an unshakable sense of self. Her mind wandered back through the years, the sacrifices unseen, the nights of quiet planning, the endless patience it had taken to safeguard what she had built. Every decision, every precaution had been dismissed as trivial by him, yet those very choices had armed her with strength. He had sought validation in applause and dominance, but her validation was rooted in something deeper, the knowledge that dignity cannot be taken away, only surrendered. The irony struck her while he had basked in the spotlight. Mocking her as secondary, she had been the architect of stability. His mask of grandeur had always been fragile, and tonight it had finally shattered. The man who had once commanded attention now sat in isolation, stripped of allies. His arrogance exposed as nothing more than weakness, dressed as pride. Not all had turned away, though. Among the family members who lingered in shame, some approached her with softened eyes, humbled by her quiet strength. A nephew who once ignored her contributions whispered an apology, vowing never again to measure worth by arrogance. A niece, who had rolled her eyes at her traditions, now asked to learn from her to inherit not just wealth, but wisdom. These moments touched her, reminding her that resilience was not just about standing alone, but also about inspiring others to see differently. And yet, reconciliation was not universal. Her husband, the man who had declared her worthless before the world, now sat in the ruins of his own pride. He muttered excuses, reaching for sympathy, but no one listened. The very guests he had sought to impress remembered only his cruelty, and the family he thought he controlled now gravitated toward her. His isolation was not her revenge, it was the natural consequence of arrogance colliding with truth. She reflected quietly. Life had tested her with cruelty, but it also rewarded her patience. The lesson was clear. True worth is not measured in applause, not granted by titles, not validated by those who look down upon you. True worth lies in foresight, in the quiet resilience to endure storms, and in the strength to rise with dignity when others expect you to crumble. As she closed the folder and set it aside, she smiled again, not the mysterious smile of earlier, but one of liberation. The masks had fallen, the truth had been revealed, and she no longer carried the burden of proving herself. Those who saw her strength would walk with her. Those who clung to arrogance would fade into their own shadows. She had been declared worthless, but tonight she reclaimed everything: her voice, her dignity, her legacy. And in the silence that followed, she realized that was the truest form of victory. The words still lingered in the air, worthless. It had been hurled at her on the night meant to honor their union, spoken with such arrogance that he believed it would define her. But as she sat in the quiet aftermath, she understood why she had smiled in that moment. His insult had not wounded her. It had exposed him. He was blind to the truth, blind to the fortress of strength she had quietly built, blind to the reality that the very ground he stood upon no longer belonged to him, her. Smile was not of submission, but of certainty. She smiled because she knew that even as he declared her powerless, his downfall had already begun. The documents, the wealth, the ownership, they were not merely assets, but symbols of her resilience. While he had invested in appearances, she had invested in permanence. He thought he had stripped her of dignity, but instead he had revealed the emptiness of his own. The guests who had once clapped for his jokes now remembered only his cruelty. The family who once admired his authority now turned their gaze toward her quiet strength. His voice, once loud, had lost its echo. And she, the woman he had tried to erase with a single word, stood taller than ever. The moral was undeniable. Arrogance burns bright but burns out quickly, leaving only ashes. Dignity, however, endures like a flame protected against the wind. True power is not in shouting the loudest, but in preparing silently, standing firmly and rising when least expected. That was why she smiled, not out of defiance, not out of vengeance, but out of wisdom. Because in that moment she knew she had not only survived his insult, she had transcended it. He called her worthless, but history, family, and truth would remember her as the one who endured, who planned, and who ultimately prevailed. And so the story closed not with his voice, but with her smile. The eternal reminder that arrogance fades, but dignity endures.